All right, welcome. My name is Eli Storch. I'm the chair of the Design Advocacy Group. We have a wonderful evening program tonight. I'm glad everyone is here joining us. So before we get into the announcements that start our meeting, just a quick reminder, our DAG meetings are typically off the record, but we are using Zoom and we have the capacity to record and share it with a broader audience. So we are electing to do that. You've had to check a little button that says you're okay with that, but be aware that unlike a typical in-person DAG meeting, this meeting is on record. So with that technology, our past Zoom presentations are available on our website, including our most recent meeting with Shalimar Thomas from North Broad Renaissance. So you can go to our website events tab and check that out. So in order to do general announcements, we'd ask that you submit, just raise your hand or submit a little chat into the chat window if you have any specific announcements about upcoming events or anything you'd like to share with the group before we get into the larger program. And while you do that, also, if you have any technical issues throughout the program, you can message David Brownlee. David, wave your hand. Or Claire Adler, Claire. And they'll be able to help you to the best of their abilities.
The truth is, there's not much we can do. If it's a problem, it's probably your computer, but it's kind of...
I stand by my statement. They are very helpful. So while everyone has a chance to send those chats in if they have anything to discuss, why don't we send it over to Marcia Moss, who runs our programming here at DAG, to just give you a little taste and tell you about our next upcoming DAG program.
Okay, thanks Eli, and hi everyone. Please mark October 15th for our next meeting on the Historic Home Repair Program. The Strawberry Mansion CDC, under the direction of Tanetta Graham, is partnering with LISC to design and implement the program. Brandon Taylor will participate and Verónica Ayala Flores will moderate the panel. The aim of the project is to sustain home ownership for over 25 owner-occupied homes throughout the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood. So there's much more to know about it, and we hope to see you on October 15th. Thanks, Eli.
Absolutely. So we have Lori Salganikoff. Do you want to turn your mic on and share a little bit about Night of Lights in Chestnut Hill?
Sure, thank you. I'm driving, sorry. So Night of Lights this will be the 4th year the Chestnut Hill Conservancy is doing this. It's basically an exhibition from the archives of the area. And it will be projected through storefront windows and onto buildings along Germantown Avenue in Chestnut Hill. Architecture will be lit. There are a number of really interesting themes and guest curated content from the Germantown Historical Society and the Springfield Township Historical Society. It's usually one night. It goes from October 9th to the 25th, and it's every night in that during that time. And I put the URL in the chat so everyone can see. But we really hope everyone can come out, take your time, and see layers of history on top of a wonderful commercial corridor.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you.
And any other events, upcoming speeches, talks, other things anyone wants to share with the group?
I would like to share something. This is Paul Steinke, if I may.
Go for it, Paul.
Thank you. So we are announcing by email tomorrow our fall 2020 speaker series. And we have 6 of them lined up. We have David Barnes, Dr. David Barnes, about the Lazaretto. We have Liz Trumbull and Andrew Fearon about restoring the Al Capone cell at Eastern State Penitentiary. Theodore Proudhon, the president of Docomomo out of New York, will be speaking. Then we have Charles Duff speaking about his book, The North Atlantic Cities, a book about why Philadelphia and some other northeastern cities have row houses, but most American cities do not. So if you've ever wondered why that is, he's written a whole book about it. He'll be speaking on November 24th. We have Reverend Mark Tyler speaking about the legacy of Mother Bethel AME Church, the oldest continuously owned property by African Americans in the United States. And finally, on December 15th, we have Dr. Diane Turner, the curator of the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American Collection, speaking on their select resources on Black women. So it's 6 nights starting October 13th, and more will be coming out on our website and by email and Facebook tomorrow.
Thank you, Paul. Rob Cattell is asking just the time on the October meeting. I put the link in the chat. It's Thursday, October 15th at 10 a.m. So you can mark your calendars for that. Just one last little bits of business as we, before we get started. DAG has started a new feature called the Dag Dispatch. It comes out every Monday morning, and it's a little summary of the past week's architecture, design, development, planning news from around the city. We're trying to do that to get that out Monday morning as a way to get caught up as you start the week. So if you go onto our forum section of our website, you can check that out. Speaking of the DAG forum, that is an opportunity for anybody to contribute to the DAG website. If you have an idea, if there's a particular topic that comes to mind, we're always accepting posts to post on that DAG forum. So feel free to contact David Brownlee or the DAG Fellow at dagfellow@gmail.com. And that is a great way to get your opinions up onto the DAG website via that DAG forum page. So thank you again for coming. It's a pleasure to have everyone here for this evening's program. Whose history is it? The democratization of preservation. We have a wonderful panel here tonight. And to get things started, it's my pleasure to introduce Harris Steinberg, who will lead tonight's conversation and will introduce you to the other panelists. Harris, in addition to being a longtime friend of DAG, has, in addition to founding Penn Praxis, he is the founding executive director of the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation at Drexel. His many other notes of acclaim. He was the chair of the Philadelphia Task Force on Historic Preservation, which he did for Mayor Kenney from 2017 to 2018. He was awarded the Wick Strickland Award for his contributions to the cultural life of Philadelphia. And back in 2006 and 2007, Harris led the award-winning public planning process to create the civic vision for the Central Delaware Riverfront. So Harris, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to meeting the rest of the panelists and a lively conversation.
Great, thank you, Eli. It's wonderful to be here. Yes, I was an early DAG kind of participant steering committee member, and just remember the really vital role that it played in the early days. And it's wonderful to see it continue to be a force for good in Philadelphia. So thank you for having us. I'm going to kind of contextualize the conversation, but before that, I just want to kind of nod to the panelists and my kind of fellow sojourners this evening. Betty Turner, whom you'll hear from in a little bit, is an activist and a member of the Philadelphia Historical Commission. If you don't know Betty, if she gets your cell phone number, you will know Betty, because you'll get texts and very positive, kind of at any time of day and night. We have Yue Wu, from a neighborhood planning and project manager for the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation. I'm going to give you guys a little chance to introduce yourselves in a bit, so hang in there. Verónica Ayala Flores, I know you know because she's a member of your steering committee, but she's a program assistant at LISC. Dominique Hawkins, a principal at Preservation Design Partnership, and I had the pleasure, distinct pleasure, of Dominique helping as vice chair of the Philadelphia Historic Preservation Task Force. She really did all the work, so that's the same for this evening. So Dominique, thank you. All right, but in all seriousness, the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police in late May, unleashed in the midst of the worst pandemic in the US in a century, sweeping civil unrest across the country and focused our attention on the scourge of institutional racism that has permeated American life, economics, politics, and policy since the first slave ship appeared off the coast of Virginia in 1619. Protesters quickly began to call for the removal of monuments that celebrated these inglorious stains on the American soul and psyche, particularly monuments to the Confederacy that blanket the South. In Philadelphia, we saw the swift call for and removal of the statue of former Mayor Frank Rizzo, a police commissioner known for using police brutality against minorities in the 1960s and 70s. And as mayor from 1975 to 83, the pattern continued. When a statue was erected on Rayburn Plaza in 1999, it was viewed by many as a symbol of racism and division. On June 3rd, 2020, under cloak of darkness, the Rizzo statue was removed. Dominique and I thought that this would be a good moment to start a conversation on how history is written, preserved, and viewed by people from varying backgrounds and cultures. We know that history has all too often been written by the powerful and the victorious, leaving minorities and the disenfranchised little voice or agency. We also know that history has all too often been used to stifle creativity and independence and foster groupthink on the society. As chair and vice chair of the recent Philadelphia Historic Preservation Task Force, we felt that a conversation about democratizing historic preservation in Philadelphia was long overdue. The task force recognized this, and in our recommendations, which were issued in spring 2018, we called for new policies and practices that would widen participation in historic preservation. That is where we begin the conversation this evening, and it is focused on the role of historic preservation in the life of the citizens of Philadelphia. We want to stress that this is only the start of a conversation and a single evening in late September among friends. We know that there is much work to be done, and we hope that tonight's exchange is but one of many to come as we work together to build a bigger tent where everyone is welcome, where all voices are heard, and where all histories are preserved and cherished. Writing on the heels of the murder of George Floyd in May, the National Trust for Historic Preservation issued this statement. We believe that historic preservation can play a critical role in acknowledging and healing the divisions in our nation by telling the full story of our often difficult history, by elevating and preserving the enormous and important contributions African Americans have made to our nation, and by carrying that powerful legacy forward through places of truth and reconciliation. We also believe that recognizing the dedication of communities of color to the American experiment, to the places we work to save, from Rosenwald schools to the home of Madam C.J. Walker, will help to inspire innovation, investment, and faith in our democracy. I'm going to now ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then Dominique will kind of share some of her thinking and our thinking around the geographic and social imbalance of building sites and monuments that are listed on the Philadelphia Register. So Betty, do you want to say a few words?
Okay, good evening, everyone. I am delighted to be here, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm delighted to be here, and I thank Dag for this event, and I especially give a huge thanks to Harris and Dominique for the opportunity to participate with the panelists on this important subject. And I'm very interested in historic preservation and have been for a long time. I am currently serving on the Historical Commission as vice chair. I am the president of the Urban Resources Development Corporation in Philadelphia. I serve as a board member of the Green Street Friends School. And I recently was happy to hear and excited to hear and to know that I am the AIA Philadelphia 2020 Paul Philippe Cray awardee. And when I looked at the list of prior awardees, I was jumping for joy, and I was delighted to be a part of such an illustrious group.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
All right.
That's it for me.
Yue, can you top that one?
Wow, how impressive. Congrats, Betty.
Just a few years on you. So.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Harris and Dominic, for organizing the panel, and thanks, Dag, for hosting it. My name is Yue Wu. I'm Neighborhood Planning and Project Manager at Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation. I have been working closely with Chinatown's immigrants community on community planning and equitable development advocacy. I have a background in historic preservation and have been an advocate for cultural preservation, especially for historically disadvantaged communities.
Great, thank you and welcome. Veronica, you're up next.
Yes, thank you, of course, to Harris and Dominique and Yue and Betty for sharing this space with me. So my name is Verónica Ayala. I serve as a program assistant for LISC, or Local Initiative Support Corporation. I also serve as the Design Equity Task Force Chair for DAG. I have a background in architecture. I studied architecture at Temple. But currently, I think what attracted Harris and Dominique to invite me to this panel, I serve as a co-chair for a committee in Eastern North Philadelphia, the Arts and Culture Committee, and we've been working on a project called Experience Eastern North, which is basically a tour program that tries to highlight kind of a lot of the cultural treasures that exist in Eastern North. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Great, thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my partner in this effort, Dominique Hawkins.
Hi, thank you all for joining us tonight and for DAG for allowing us to have this conversation. As Harris said, this is really the beginning of a conversation. We don't pretend to have all of the answers. If you could put the slideshow up, that would be great, the PowerPoint. So we don't pretend to have all the answers. So certain things came out during the task force in terms of understanding the fact that a lot of the city had not been surveyed. And there's a lot of communities and neighborhoods that are not represented in the current Philadelphia Historical Commission umbrella. And in terms of thinking about what that means, we wanted to see how we can expand this tent. As Harris had indicated. And in looking at the tent, if you could go to the next slide, please. One of the things to keep in mind is that the way preservation, I think most people think about preservation, is they think about properties that are 50 years old and looking at what can be designated. So I have a couple of maps here that jump through time that hopefully will give a sense of what Philadelphia looked like at different times. So next slide. And next slide. So if you look at this map of Philadelphia from the 60s, what you can see is most of the city actually meets that 60 or 50-year criteria. This is 70 years ago. But when you compare this, next slide, to what the registered properties are that are on the Philadelphia Historical Register, you can see that there are a large majority of neighborhoods and places in the city which are not designated. Next slide. And if you compare it to the National Register list, so the National Register list is different than the Philadelphia Register. The National Register doesn't have the regulatory control that we have in Philadelphia. There is, I would suggest that actually a greater array of properties listed on the National Register than there are on the City Register. Next slide. I think the most distressing thing that I learned in the process of being on the task force is that of all the properties listed in the city of Philadelphia, 70% of them are located in the Central Planning District. So of the 11,500 properties listed, sites listed in Philadelphia, over 8,000 are in the Central Planning District, which means that there are huge parts of the city which are underrepresented. So what the reality of this is that in each of these neighborhoods, there are places that are important to the people who live there. And we are not at this point giving the opportunity or the information or the incentive for those populations to take advantage of some of the things that are offered by designation in Philadelphia. So one of the things that I also would like to bring to light, and people think about buildings as sort of precious, beautiful objects, But there are two criteria for designation in the city that I would like to use to frame a discussion today. And it's really designation criteria based upon cultural importance. One is a property has significant character, interest, or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the city, commonwealth, or nation, or is associated with the life of a person significant in the past. The second is that it exemplifies the cultural, political, economic, social, or historical heritage of the community. So things don't necessarily have to be precious pieces of architecture to be listed on the Philadelphia Register. So what this conversation is intended to do is open up the possibility of saying, okay, if we have huge swaths of the city that are not represented and we have interest in preservation, whatever that means, and there may also be a language issue here, how can we broaden our audience to be more inclusive and tell everybody's story? So with that, Harris, I turn it back over to you, and I think we can get rid of the presentation for now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dominique. Yeah, you're going to hear a lot tonight about kind of cultural heritage, because in many ways, among the, I think, many recommendations that the task force made, this was pretty important. The recognition that it's not just building sites and objects of famous kind of dead white people, excuse the crude characterization, but that the city is really rich and replete with many, many histories and many, many stories that preservation is not capturing. So I'm going to start with Betty. Betty, you've talked a lot about challenges to participating in preservation, understanding what it means to be listed on the register. Do you find from your work kind of in the city as well as in the commission itself, that this has been an obstacle to really including more people in the preservation of cultural history in Philadelphia?
Yeah, I think there are some challenges. And at this moment in time, the most positive thing in the challenges is that it's open and people are ready to hear different things and they're ready to have conversations like this. But I think that the challenges that we have seen have to do with lack of understanding of culture, of language, lack of understanding really what historic preservation is and what it's about and who can participate in it and how you participate in it. So there's a lot of need for outreach, conversation, exchange, going out into the neighborhoods, and those are some of the challenges. I also think that right now, some of the racial issues are bringing to fore the fact that minorities have been involved in historic preservation in a very limited way, both as professionals and also as being involved in conversations relative to historic designation and other kinds of things like that. So those are some of the main challenges that I see. Also the fact, another one is the fact that ownership, as soon as people think of historic preservation, if and when they think of it, they think of home ownership. And the Moody's Investment Services just recently reported that home ownership among Blacks is 44% and 74% among whites. So you can see that, you know, the home ownership and whether I can be a part of this or should be a part of this is information that needs to get out there.
Do you think that is the primary barrier to entry among minorities, or is it education? Is it skill sets, costs of compliance? How do we begin to think about, again, bringing more people into the process? Opening
up historic preservation. We have professionals, we have organizations, we have groups that have dealt with historic preservation for a long time. Minorities have not been involved I think open it up, have the conversations, go into the neighborhoods, you know, share and connect, begin to increase awareness and understanding of the various cultures and the language. Also recognize that this is a new day and a new time, and there's different styles of responding and different ways to respond, new approaches to how we respond to things. We're in the digital age now. Some of us are highly educated around in that area, and others are not. We have to look at these things and assess where we are, and then get out there into the neighborhoods and open it up and invite people in.
Great. That's actually a perfect kind of segue into the first question for you. Where are you, Yue? You have talked about the importance of cultural history and the challenges that racial and ethnic minorities are facing in terms of cultural preservation. How can historic preservation be a tool for cultural preservation through the prism of sites such as the Vietnamese shopping plaza in South Philadelphia that you spoke with us about? That is an important cultural touchstone. Do you want to reflect on that?
Yes, just following Betty's point about outreach, I think another barrier for minorities to enter is actually recognizing their actually paid efforts, preserving their cultural heritage. And cultural preservation is very important, but also very challenging for historically disadvantaged communities. And Hoping Plaza is a great example. It's a Vietnamese shopping plaza located at 16th and Washington Avenue. For people who are not familiar with this case, it was the first shopping plaza that serves Southeast Asian immigrants in Philadelphia region. And it includes supermarkets, 2 restaurants, and several other small businesses. And the plaza is a cherished community space, and people had a lot of shared memories there. But in last year to 2019, a developer bought the land and proposed to build a large block of townhouses there. And the Southeast Asian community was outraged by the development plan. The project would essentially erase part of Philadelphia's immigrant and refugee history. But there aren't really many tools the community can use. The plaza is a very boring 1-story rectangular building, and it's very unlikely to be designated. And the only thing stop the developer moving forward is that they need a zoning variance to build housing on the land zoned as industrial use. So several community organizations, including the LEAD and Cambodian Association of the Greater Philadelphia, they tagged the ZBA hearing to voice the opposition. And the business, they delayed the process, but the business had to move out during the COVID. So during one of the organizing efforts, a community leader actually said a very touching saying, and I have the quote here. I know how important it is to know your culture, respect it, and have evidence of it around you. Unfortunately, in many disadvantaged communities, instead of seeing evidence of our culture, we see too much evidence of what we have lost. If we look at Chinatown, we lost almost 20% of land to Vine Street Expressway. And if we look at Strawberry Mansion, the John Coltrane mural will be displaced again by development for the second time in less than a decade. And how can historic preservation be a tool for cultural preservation? I think cultural preservation is a part of historic preservation, and even it is an important goal of historic preservation. And a good starting point is probably to explore tools and policies that not only protect physical historic fabric, but also the intangible heritage. For instance, we could look at San Francisco's Cultural Heritage District and Legacy Business Registry for some valuable lessons. And in the case of Hoping Plaza, the community is already taking actions to preserve their culture, and the community will is there. What we really need to do is to give them a tour that fits the purpose and to empower them, to help them and support them.
Yes.
Really kind of an eye-opener into kind of how different people view preservation and how we kind of articulate what's important and what are the policies and regulatory tools we can use to protect that which is important. Can you speak a little bit about this tension then between traditional preservation, which is what kind of we have used as a tool for kind of preserving the past, and cultural preservation? Maybe tease out a little bit of kind of what you think are the differences between the two and the similarities.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it is especially important for us today to look at this question through a social justice lens. So traditional preservation has been heavily focused on built heritage, but not everyone was able to build magnificent buildings in the history, right? So who decide to create monuments and who are able to build the buildings? When wealthy people and resourceful people build their mansions and monuments, people of color who are experiencing centuries of systemic racism and oppression couldn't even own land, let alone building impressive mansions with elaborate architectural details. So not only did the minority community have less resources to create physical heritage, their heritage and history are more likely to be lost. Some lost to urban renewal, some lost to gentrification. So it's really, really hard for these communities to keep physical or cultural heritage. So if we look at what we have kept, we have preserved, they are really representing the values of people who have power. So I see cultural preservation as an opportunity to change the power dynamic because it focuses on people and it has to be community driven. It is an opportunity for people to take back the power and use their own language to define cultural heritage and historic preservation. So in contrast to the professionals, communities might assign different values and priorities to historic buildings, traditions, festivals, food, and they might take very different approaches to preserve their culture. For example, the Southeast Asian community, they didn't really think about historic preservation as a tool, but they relied on their organizing. So from another perspective, traditional preservation also can be at odds with cultural preservation. So it really depends on who is using the tool and for what purpose. So even in Chinatown North area, it's the area above Vine Street, and some people also call it Callow Hill, and this is a neighborhood where the new Real Park is located, but it also is the home to a lot of Chinese immigrants and some small business and small manufacturing businesses. So we've seen a lot of change in that neighborhood. A developer acquired a lot of historic industrial properties and renovated them into hip workspace, art studios, and apartment buildings. They are definitely drawing a different population and creating a different vision for the neighborhood. And they are doing preservation. So it's really actually
complicated.
Threatening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
threatening the immigrant community's cultural and social fabric. And
I mean, it's really about dialogue and how we make choices, and not necessarily one way or the other.
Yeah, and people even have different tastes,
of course,
and visions for the neighborhood.
Well, thank you for that. This is another, you've teed up my conversation with Veronica, which is next, because going from cultural preservation to cultural identity, Veronica, let's see where you are. You've spoken about the importance of cultural identity in how, let's see, we think about preservation of the city. When we think about the vibrant North 5th Street corridor, for example, in North Philadelphia, we are reminded how important these areas are to citizens from a wide range of backgrounds. How can historic preservation maintain and celebrate the identity of commercial corridors such as North 5th Street?
Yeah, thank you. First, also, Yue, I don't know how to follow that. Like, that was great. So, yeah, I can talk about my experience, right? So when I moved to the mainline, I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and I moved here when I was 13. And like Yue was saying, there's a loss that comes with that, right? And so coming to North Philadelphia and then realizing that there were spaces that I could go get the food that I'm used to and the sweets that I love, you know, that I for a while thought I had completely lost, was an amazing experience. And a lot of those little special places sometimes are not known to the community itself, and they're not known kind of more broadly as places that are valuable and that should be visited and preserved, right? And so when I think about historic preservation, I really would urge people to kind of broaden the scope of what they think about when they say historic preservation, right? Kind of to really echo just what Yue was saying. And so to think about like what are practices and what are models that we can use to actually celebrate that. And so in talking about the Experience Eastern North project, we had set out to really rethink how tours are designed and how they're promoted. And so we were looking to not just have tours that kind of you sat on a bus and pointed at things and, you know, here's that amazing building, like not that experience, but instead coming into a neighborhood and being guided by the people that live there in saying, hey, like these are the spaces that we use a lot and they matter because of this reason. And here are the challenges that we're facing and how you can participate in fixing those or in helping us, you know, set values and things that we're going to go forward with. So yeah, to answer your question, like I think there are a lot of ways, like for example, tours where we can think about the different audiences and not just simply, you know, people that are coming from outside of Philadelphia. I mean, that is also a definitely an audience, but even when we're looking at our own neighborhoods, like how can we have this cultural exchange that really kind of, you know, respects other people's cultural backgrounds. And I think, you know, here in the US, we're so good about understanding kind of this like melting pot culture is important, but we don't actually have the practices that allow us to preserve those folks that are those cultural bearers and that actually come with that culture. And so we have to think about ways that we can preserve that. And I would offer just one model that is replicable is thinking about how tours and those dynamics can change.
Very interesting. Through your work at LISC, I'm wondering if you've come across CDCs or other local groups that are actually promoting history and culture, but call it something else.
Yeah.
Are there movements out there that we can think about, emulate, understand to help kind of, again, broaden the tent?
Yeah. So yeah, definitely there's a lot of examples. So North 5th Revitalization Project, kind of up in Olney, also does tours that are food tours. So that commercial corridor is one of the most diverse in the city. And so I think before COVID, I'm really not sure how they've adapted, but they were doing food tours. And that was one way to, Marsha, I think you're unmuted.
Somebody, yeah.
Oh.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things that they were doing, right, is it's showcasing the diversity of their neighborhood through food. And that's something that everyone can enjoy.
Similarly, CMAC in South Philadelphia has this food truck. Again, I think they think about it as economic development, but in a way it's preservation because they're taking folks who might be displaced because of wars or something like that, and actually creating an incubator where people can share their food, and you know, professional chefs and people that know how to make food, they just give them the space to actually share that and sell their products. So in a way, you know, that culture that might have been lost from them being displaced and moving here is preserved that way. And I think another example, and this might be a little out there, but I'm also involved with a group called Stadium Stompers, and in a way,
let me just stop here. I'm going to mute everyone, and then Veronica can unmute herself. Okay, I'm muting everyone.
Sure. Did that work?
It seems to have.
Great, thank you. So I was going to say, so the group Stadium Stompers, which I'm involved with, I think is another example of how you can think about resisting, or, you know, because in a way, I think that battle was about land justice, kind of to what Yue was talking about, but it's also a battle of culture, right? Like this idea that football culture is more important than the culture that was already in that neighborhood. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can kind of expand and really reassess how we think about, preservation.
Yeah, wonderful. Dominique, wherever you are, I thought maybe you could add some context to the conversations we had within the task force about how to, at least within the strictures of the current rules and regulations of the Historical Commission, bring in a more nuanced and kind of varied view of preservation, with culture obviously being kind of one of the key kind of talking points that we used. Are you here?
I'm here. Oh,
right.
Sorry, I realized I forgot. I've turned my video off. I apologize. Saving bandwidth.
That's okay. You look like you're in a law library.
I know, right? So before I do that, I'm actually going to tell a story, because we heard such great stories from Betty and Veronica and Yue. So I'm going to share one of my experiences. I actually worked in New Orleans post-Katrina, and my task there was to do design guidelines for the city of New Orleans. So it encompassed about 14,000 properties. And it was post-Katrina. Things were rough, except where they weren't, where you would expect it would all be beautiful. It was all beautiful, but in some neighborhoods, it was still really rough. So I would rent SUVs because I could roll down the window and take a photo and not get out of my car. And it was that degree of rough. So I had all my fancy camera equipment, and I needed 4 or 5 photos within a 2-block radius, all one-way streets, all going the wrong way for where I should be rolling down my window. And I said, forget it, I'm getting out, I'm gonna take a walk, and I'm just gonna take my pictures. So I'm standing on a corner, and a gentleman pulled up to me in a very beat up car, a young man, and he looked at me and he said, ma'am, what you doing? And I explained, and he pulled over. I had no idea where that conversation was going. And he came up to me and said, you shouldn't be out here. And the response, which my city girl head went to, was, holy crap, all I really need is the memory card, everything else is insured. What ended up happening, which was the beautiful part of it, is he said, I'm going to walk you around my neighborhood and show you my history. So he said, I want you to get it right, and I want you to hear it from me. And that was a real, I'll say, moment in my carpetbagger preservation career, where I show up in different cities and have all the answers, because this young man told me his version of his history of his neighborhood. And that was actually the most important history that I got. So that's the context under which I would ask us all to think about this. There are people who are very much in their own neighborhoods across Philadelphia who know their history and their places that are important. And those places could be important because of a piece of architecture, because of a cultural, because everyone goes to that church, that corner store, that hall, whatever it might be. And in looking at the work of the task force, we had a lot of work to do in a very short period of time. And one of the regrets I had, and it's not for lack of trying, we were tackling too many things, but one of the regrets I had was that we didn't really address how to manage the preservation of cultural heritage. I don't feel like we came up with a good set of recommendations for that issue. So this conversation really came out of that dialogue. I think the ordinance certainly provides us with the mechanism, the tool for designating them. But for example, the rules that we would apply to historic preservation in terms of if you're going to fix the building, you have to do X, Y, or Z may not be appropriate in a cultural context. And it may overburden the applicant in a way that is inappropriate. So how do we balance that?
Well, we did make recommendations for kind of a tiered kind of designation, categories. We talked about different districts. So I think there was an attempt to go there, but what you're saying is we didn't go far enough.
I don't think we went far enough. And I think on a district basis, I think we started to come up with solutions that can work within the city framework in our enabling legislation. So in that context, I really think we did. The law library has just become relevant now that I'm speaking like an attorney, but, but I think under that context, yes, we handled it at a neighborhood scale, but we didn't handle it at a place scale, a property scale, an event scale, or something where the physical fabric of the street or the space is important, not necessarily the building.
Yeah.
So, so this is really a sort of call to arms, for lack of a better way of putting it. I know there are other cities that are doing this well, and or have started this conversation or have implemented different things where this is starting to move forward. And I think we could learn from those. But I think one of the things we have to do is start reconciling how we get the people of Philadelphia's neighborhoods to start telling their story and starting engaging them in this process.
Betty, do you want to kind of weigh in on that? You need to unmute yourself, or David needs to unmute you.
You lost her.
David, can you unmute?
Yeah, no,
Betty?
actually, I can't unmute her. I've asked her to unmute herself.
Betty.
Betty, unmute yourself.
The opposite of what Joe Biden would say. All right. While Betty is trying to unmute herself, I guess Veronica or Yue, do you have any kind of thoughts to how we might, really get down to that granular level of not only engaging a much wider constituency, but being able to kind of distill kind of these cultural stories that are often lost to the kind of sweep of traditional history?
I think one of the things I've been thinking about is that since we admit that we don't have all the answers and the people at the place know the place best, maybe one approach is just to follow their lead. Like if they are doing something to preserve their own cultural heritage, maybe we just...
I think we have Betty.
Yeah,
I feel a little bit like Houston. We have a problem. All right, Betty.
All right,
sorry,
I'm
Yue.
sorry.
Hold that thought.
I'm sorry. I was having a problem with this digital technology.
Understood.
However, I was listening to all the points that were made, and several words kept coming up: thinking, dialogue, and I was thinking about engaging and connection and getting people excited about participating. And I was thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to get our thinking on the same level. And what I mean by this is, as we learn things, we usually use as our frame of reference, and for getting things, we use knowledge, comprehension, and application. In terms of decision making and thinking, that's the first order of thinking. But there's a second order of thinking that professionals get engaged in a lot, which seems to me to be synthesis, analysis, and evaluation. And it's important that as we have these conversations, we're not talking across each other, but kind of on the same page and kind of checking ourselves to see whether or not we are. And this kind of meeting and conversation and work that's being done, and the work of the task force and all the new things that are being done, is a very positive new approach and a different kind of a commitment to democratizing historic preservation, I think. And I think that if we keep moving forward in this direction, we will increase participation in historic preservation in very good and long-term and effective ways.
That's very encouraging and inspiring.
That's what I think.
Yue, I cut you off. Thank you, Betty. Do you want to pick it back up?
Well, there's not much more. A lot has been said about culture and language, and those are important things. I think the start of the work of the task force and where the Historic Commission is at this point, and the new ordinances and all of that coming together, will increase participation. I think those new ordinances that were passed in terms of historic preservation are major kind of steps to moving us forward.
Do you want to remind people what the new ordinances are?
Well, off the top of my head, I maybe you should, if you would do it, I would appreciate
Betty, I can
help me. Can you help me? Thank you.
Betty, I can help you out, but I want Yue to finish her thought, and then I will provide that information.
Okay. All right. So anyway, that's my thought about the ordinances, the engaging. I also think that the opening up and in widening the conversation and bringing in more people into this conversation will make the difference in historic preservation, and will engage people, and will also help people to take ownership. Because if you can take ownership of something, you are more likely to be committed to its effort or how it turns out, or giving your input or what. And when challenges are in the mix, we need to address those challenges right there, openly. Be willing to dissect and, figure out, well, where's the differences? Where are we similar and where are the differences? Also, language and behavior. For example, in some cultures, be they African-American, Chinese, Latino, Hispanic, behavior in terms of what a word means or how an action occurs can be different in those cultures, can be different. And we need to, I think, listening with a big L, capital listening, is very important in these days too. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of things going on, and we really have to listen and to figure out what we need to do away with and what is valuable. What do we need to keep and what is not important? What the goal is and the direction and how to reach this goal. What things are distractions? We have lots of distractions. For example, bad things happen in Philadelphia. Lots of distractions, and those kinds of things.
Are you talking about last night?
Those kinds of things. There's bad trouble and good trouble as you listen to your news every day, and the way we get our information. And so we have to be able to decode those and say, question this. Is this good? Is this not good? How are we doing that? Who's doing it?
And why?
And why? Yeah, who's doing it and why? And what is the expected and the intended outcome? What is the expected and intended outcome?
Yep.
And so that's pretty much.
All right. Now, thank you, Betty. I'm going to go back to Yue to finish her thought, and then to Dominique, and maybe have Veronica wrap us up, because there's a lot of questions that are coming up on the chat, and I think David wants to moderate that, correct?
Harris, you may want to moderate it. If you'd prefer to just keep going, you're sort of
Yeah.
one to off things.
Okay.
I can do what you like, but
Yue, you want to continue your thought that we interrupted?
I agree with everything that he said, and just adding on that, I think one of the approaches I've been thinking about is really following what the community is doing already, because we need to recognize that they are already making efforts to preserve what's valuable for them. And it could be affordable housing because they want to keep the residents in the neighborhood. It could be commercial corridor support because small businesses are the providing the jobs and the anchor of the neighborhood. It could be community organizing because that's how they are always doing and getting the things done. That's their way. So maybe one thing we need to think about is how preservationists as professionals, we might want to expand our vocabulary and our toolbox to include like other things we didn't think about before.
Yes.
Yes, very important. Dominique, you're going to enlighten us.
Let's go to Veronica, and then I'll wrap it up because I have a lot of information.
Wrap up. All right.
Sure.
Veronica, some closing thoughts?
Yeah. Two things stood out to me. I mean, yes, I agree with everything that Betty and Yue, they're just like wealth of knowledge. But I would also add to that that, you know, historic preservation probably should do like a reckoning with its history and like check its curriculum and see what it's teaching and prioritizing, and what histories it's, you know, actually continuously preserving. And then another question that I think people can ask themselves is like, what are the mechanisms that you're creating that support the building of relationships between different people? So one of the things that this tour program that we're designing does is that it tries to bring like students and new residents to the places where they can invest. Like, hey, instead of buying your food at, I don't know, Walmart, like here's a local grocery store that has been here for 90 years and you know, we know the owner and you can have a relationship with them, right? And so what are the mechanisms that we're allowing or exposing people to that provide alternatives and how they can foster relationships with you know, the people who live there already?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind, and this is not a deep and profound thought, but preservation is essentially a reflection of who we are as a people. It's not just individual peoples. And what I'm hearing tonight is how we begin to kind of weave kind of that understanding into kind of our policies and practices, so that we're not just showcasing a thin and narrow kind of band of humanity, but really the full, rich kind of complement of who we are. And it's not just the great architecture, as Yue said. It's the shopping plazas, it's the bodegas, it's the small kind of houses that make up the sum total of who we are. Dominique.
Okay.
Take us home.
So at some point, if we could get the last slide up, that would be great. But a couple of things that came out of the task force and some things that have happened since. So as part of the Planning 2025 effort by the City of Philadelphia, the planners went throughout the city in the various planning districts, and they actually heard from the neighbors what was important to them. It wasn't a formal preservation survey by any means, but at least it provides a basis for a conversation to start. These are the two principal publications that came out of the task force. The one on the left was actually done by Penn Praxis and is a neighborhood preservation toolkit. It has a lot of really good information in it. And on the right are the key recommendations from the task force. They're both available on the website listed below. I also contacted the city and got an update on all of the things that have happened since this was released, which was a year and a half ago. The city's Division of Development Services has created a historic preservation policy team made up of 15 city departments who actually talk about historic preservation.
And that was our #1 recommendation, that we needed to.
#1 recommendation.
City had to talk to itself.
Talk to each other. So preservation is becoming part of the lexicon and the vocabulary of the city, the people in charge, which is fantastic. The Philadelphia Historical Commission staff has managed the configuration of the Arches program. And for those of you who are familiar with preservation, what Arches is, it's an open source web-based software program where you can input information about historic properties into a database. So it's not a lot of paper shuffling, so to speak. And it's also a great research tool. So people can actually go on to that platform and learn about properties in their own neighborhoods. So it's currently being configured specifically for Philadelphia, so it's not quite up and running yet, but that process is underway. The exciting thing I get to announce is that the Department of Planning and Development secured a $250,000 grant from the William Penn Foundation to start a 2-year survey effort as a kickoff to the Historic and Cultural Resource Survey effort for the city. And it will look specifically at how, I apologize, I'm reading this, tangible and intangible assets can be documented and preserved, and work closely with cultural organizations to look beyond what has been traditionally preserved in Philadelphia. As part of that effort, the first step is to actually retain a consultant to look at, convene cultural stakeholders across the city to craft how the survey plan will be developed. So there's a lot of thought going into how do we get to some of these underserved neighborhoods. So the work that Betty was celebrating, or the accomplishment Betty was celebrating, I've gotten there, is there are a couple of bills that had been passed as a result of task force recommendation, and they included allowing accessory dwelling units in homes that are on the local register. So this allows, particularly some of, perhaps thinking of the larger homes in Germantown, et cetera, to have more units in them, which will then allow them to hopefully be saved by their current owner. Reducing or eliminating parking requirements for buildings on the register, and this is location specific. Increases the number of available uses by right for special purpose buildings. So if you think of churches and things, those are sometimes hard to reuse. This provides an opportunity or alternative uses. Requiring building permit review and issuance in neighborhood conservation overlay districts before a demolition permit can be issued. And the modification of the residential tax abatement for new construction, which creates an incentive to preserve existing buildings. This is not specifically tied to preservation or something listed on the register, but any existing building. So there's a lot of good things happening as a result of task force recommendations. And I know the cities continue to work on it. I'm very proud of what we accomplished. And with that, I would say, let's open it up for some questions.
So we have a slew of them here. David, I'm going to ask you, do you want me just to go down the list, or is there any, and how much time do we have for questions, I guess is another question.
We have about 20 minutes. I mean, they're an interesting group of questions. I think I'd be inclined just to go down them. And
all right.
I think we can get through all that we've got here if people answer them quickly.
All right. So, I mean, it looks like it looks like the place to start is with Michelle Fail. What can be done to require that developers meet with interested longtime community members before they create their design plans, even before the application process it goes before the ZBA or the RCOs? In other words, do we need to flip the process? So I'll just, who would like to take that? Maybe I'll send it to Yue, because in many ways, I think this was a response to what you were talking about in terms of the housing that was going to be placed on the Vietnamese Plaza. Any thoughts on that?
It would be ideal if developers would do that, but I like my organization is a RCO. Even with RCO's power, we can review the applications. They don't normally do well in terms of community engagement. So it's very hard, and I don't have an answer. I guess it's really hard to provide incentive that's big enough for developers to do that, especially in this capitalist system. So I'm sorry, I don't really have a good answer for that, but
no, I think it's a great idea. I've certainly found through the work that I've been involved in that developers either pay now or pay later, right? If you just barrel ahead and send your plans out there are often times where they screech to a halt and it's dragged out over many years, certainly depending on where the development is proposed. So if we were to cultivate a culture of listening before designing or co-designing, however that may be a kind of a new way to kind of think about kind of development and civic engagement in this city. You know, at least tonight we're spitballing, right? We're not writing legislation, but I think it's a great way to start to think about it.
One thing that occurs to me is that a developer certainly is required to come and assess the the sewage system and the floodplain circumstances. This is part of a due diligence assessment of the terrain, in this case, cultural terrain.
The context.
Maybe there's a way to talk about to include that in the kind of survey work that you need to do when coming in for a building permit.
I like it. Any other thoughts from panelists or others?
Well, I just wanted to say, to add that where good development and good development exchanges with communities have occurred, there has been an interaction between developer and community. And there might be ways in which there can be some leadership given to developers in how to interact and engage with the community prior to the development, and engage them early in the planning of the development so that the outcome is much more satisfactory to everybody. And in some of the stories I hear in terms of development in communities, with some developers, that happens and it works fine for communities. Other developers, it doesn't. So there needs to be some broader conversation relative to that, because there's some education and teaching that needs to go with this development, this new development and this exchange in the communities, so that communities feel involved. Part of the new zoning that we have now, as I remember, and I'm kind of like a dinosaur and I go way back all the time, so forgive me, but like an elephant here. But I remember when we were doing the zoning and getting this whole zoning idea, we were talking about doing this so that it would help communities know earlier about what development is taking place. That was sort of the stimulus for how we got to this, and that some of the rules and regulations were old and outdated and we need to renew them, and that also we need to find new ways to do things and to engage the communities before the fact and not after the fact. So we have the ideas, it's just how do we get them implemented is the question.
Transparency and communication, it sounds like.
Okay.
So J.M. Duffin is asking, doesn't Philadelphia already have the tools with the existing criteria to help with cultural sites? The sites in district, that's Griffin, excuse me, were nominated or appended to include cultural significance in respective periods of significance applied. Would it be possible to apply interpretation of rules to take those issues into consideration during review of permits? What needs to be done in establishing guidelines of how to use the Secretary's Interior standards in such cases. That almost sounds like a Dominique question, because you've got the law books behind you.
There you go. So I'll take it on. In terms of districts, I think there were some really good recommendations in the task force. And one of the things that was proposed is, I will say, setting step standards in terms of what gets regulated in each district. So each district would be treated more like a conservation district, and you would decide as a district, when it got approved, what of the traditional rules of the Preservation Commission, Historic Preservation Commission would apply to you. So for example, most properties that go before the Historical Commission have to put in wood windows. So in my community, that becomes too much of a burden for the property owners in my community. So as part of this sort of step down district, we could do away with wood windows. Maybe we could have vinyl windows as an alternative. So there is a way to, in that circumstance, to, I'll say, bend or apply rules that are appropriate for the district. So we provided that mechanism as part of a recommendation of the task force. When I was on the commission and we were looking at applications for properties for which I will say cultural significance outweighed architectural significance at that moment in time, and property owners wanted to do something, but it may not have met, I will say, the letter of what the Preservation Commission typically would require, that understanding of what was significant was taken into account when we were reviewing a property. I think one of the challenges is that you're not necessarily, or in my impression was that there wasn't an even way to apply those rules across groups of properties. So it was very much a one-off. And I don't like exceptions, I like rules, and that's just who I am. So I like everybody to be treated the same. And if you're bending because this one, so-and-so, Washington slept here, John Coltrane slept here. Why should those two things be different?
That's right.
So, so I would say, I think it's there, and I think there are great attempts by the commission to be sensitive to what is architecturally important versus for something else, but it's not clean. So.
Yeah, and the commission itself is a body that it's deliberative. It's all part of a conversation. It's not necessarily black and white. To excuse the pun. Charles Kaminsky wrote something to the effect of centering preservation planning on racial and social equity, which sounds like a good line. Do we want to expand on that, Charles? I don't know if you're still here.
Charles, unmute yourself. I think he was citing a recent proclamation from the San Francisco Planning Commission.
Okay.
Charles, are you there? I don't see him.
Okay. So do you want to put a note there, David? Is there anything from San Francisco that we should be thinking about?
Well, what Charles shared was a recent proclamation in July from the San Francisco Planning Department, a resolution that fundamentally committed them to taking racial and social equity into consideration in their work. It's a very long document, and it's been shared in the chat, so you can.
Oh, I see. It's further up. Excuse me, I didn't see that.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to now turn to George Claflin, who I see is here somewhere, who said something about, wants to talk about Sharswood.
Yeah, if I just unmuted myself, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, just very quickly, I'd like to direct maybe to start with Betty. And my question is about preservation at the neighborhood scale and neighborhood development, because I see Sharswood as a case study with all sorts of opportunities and all sorts of problems. I mean, the decline of the Ridge Corridor, and maybe the economics are not there to bring it back. PHA with many good intentions builds their headquarters up there, but what do they build? Put a suburban office building? And the school district closes one of the most beautiful schools in the area, just at the point when PHA is considering a very large-scale redevelopment. And then there's the poignancy of, I mean, I almost cried when people came who had lived in the Blumberg apartments came to watch the demolition of the homes that they had lived in for so many years. And even though it was a very difficult place to live, they had an association with it. And so there's all that stewing up there. And Betty, you and I go back long enough to remember model cities, which in its own maybe naive way attempted to integrate physical and non-physical planning and apply it to neighborhoods. So where do you think Sharswood could go, could be persuaded to go, and how does preservation figure into that?
Well, I think a lot of the problems and challenges have been with where the decisions are made and when and how the funding occurs and the time spans in between, and also changes in leadership and policy and even administration at very high levels. And things change, directions change, and we have to, George, it seems to me that we have to broaden the participants at the table and make and set up some areas of commitment for enforcement of things so that even if certain things change, other things don't. And I don't know that we've gotten there yet, because every time a new administration or a new thought or a change comes in where the primary focus is, it diminishes the importance of another project that was important a while back. So I think this is something that needs to be looked into, and we need to revisit it in this day and time and see how we can avoid these kinds of things from happening. That's my thing. I think this is a point in time where we need to look at why, what are the reasons? What happened here? Why didn't this happen? And look at how can we be more effective at accomplishing the things that we state we are going to do. Even for funding or finances, are there set-asides? Do you put that money aside early on and leave it there and don't touch it? And don't put it in some fund that can be used and taken away and used for some other interest of someone? You know what I mean? How do you enforce those things and keep them there? And I agree with you. It's very uncomfortable, and it's very annoying that we continue to have the same thing over and over. But we have to, George, sit down and look at what are the problems, what allowed these kinds of things to happen. What was open? What permitted these kinds of things? What allowed them to come into the picture? And what will we do to ensure that these things don't happen? And here again, I was talking about policies and things before. Policies and where the policies are set and who the decision makers are very key to how things occur and how they happen and how they don't happen.
Yeah, and as Dominique said, oh, go ahead. Who was talking?
Yeah, if I could just add a thought to that. I think one thing that both Betty and Yue mentioned, Betty in talking about engagement, and Yue who said that a lot of the people doing this work are doing it for free. I think one tangible thing we can do is have larger community engagement budgets, and not talking about hiring the same firm that we always hire to do neighborhood plans. I'm talking about hiring people from the community to do the engagement because they know their neighborhood already and they have those critical relationships that no one else has, and just making it part of our process and budgets. And I think with that, we will uncover a lot of more opportunities.
Yes.
Well, that actually is a great lead into this next question. I don't know if Dag knows that you've gone sort of international, but here's a question from Montreal. So you guys should feel good about the reach you have. Oh, it's from Karen Cho, hello from Montreal. We are trying to get a historic designation for our Chinatown. But this also makes it extremely difficult for small landlords and building owners in the neighborhood to afford renovations to buildings. Has Philadelphia done anything to help mitigate the barriers that occur in marginalized communities hoping to preserve their history, culture, and neighborhoods? It's basically what we've been talking about all evening. Who wants to take that? Nobody?
I just want to share experience, a Chinatown experience. We definitely have similar experience here. There's actually a historic building in Chinatown called Chinese Cultural and Community Center. And the property owner is trying to renovate and reuse the building, but it took them a lot of time at Historical Commission. And it's costly process, and the project has been delayed for more than a year now, and definitely recognize that sometimes historic preservation could put burdens on small property owners and immigrants or minority homeowners. And I think we definitely need more public resource, public fundings to support this kind of effort, because we are actually putting more burdens on property owners, but we are not providing enough support for people to preserve their heritage. And just thinking like outside of the box, how can we make the heritage probably make it a public resource? Like if High Line and Rail Park can fundraising and build a park on an abandoned rail line, and can we be more creative in terms of fundraising and maybe turn the building into a museum or somewhere like people love to contribute to, just getting more support from the public.
Yeah, it's about how we set our priorities and what values are driving them.
That's right.
David, I'm going to ask, we're at 7:25. Do I have time for one more question?
Well, if I could offer one more thing. So one of the things that I would offer is one of the sort of, I'll say PSA announcements I made as a result of the task force work, in that the city is actually, everyone's talking to each other. So one of the things that I think is an important thing to consider is, can we leverage existing city programs that may be set up to do something, I'll say beneficial to preservation, but aren't preservation focused, i.e. a storefront improvement project or program to help commercial corridors do preservation. So there are many existing city-led initiatives that, if we look at it or adjust it to a preservation lens, and those conversations can, I will say, give us an assist, that may provide the resources to allow some of these projects to move forward. So the fact that the city is all talking to each other is a huge benefit in terms of these things happen.
Good.
Good point.
Good point.
So, how are we doing, David, time-wise?
Take another question. It looks like Keisha Patterson has a couple here, so let's get those in.
Okay, thank you, Eli. Number one from Keisha Patterson: how do we address places, building, and culture whose histories are not uncomplicated? Is it important to, are some commutes over trauma porn? I'm not sure what that means. Can somebody help me?
Keisha, do you want to explain yourself? I think I'm somewhat thrown by the not. I think you mean to say they are complicated.
Yes, they aren't uncomplicated.
Right.
Okay.
So how do we do complicated history?
Yes.
And what is trauma porn?
Yes.
Well, that's the sort of Detroit story, right? That's what you're thinking of there. The
not just there. I mean, I've been working on some projects that fall into this category more often than not.
What
right?
does it mean?
So, I mean, just to give a very brief example, and then I want to hear all of, these great ideas. I've been working in Buffalo, which, like Philadelphia, has lots of old buildings, sites that have been inhabited by people of color, and Black people in specific, are not registered locally or nationally, even if some of them are really these beautiful buildings, right? So in specific, there is, one of the sort of most endangered places is the Willard Park, what had been public housing. So it's beautiful. The neighborhood wants it because it's culturally significant. And then somebody will raise a flag and say, do we want to preserve the projects, right?
Oh, got it. Okay. I think I understand that.
Oh.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Who would like to tackle that? Anybody from the panel?
Well, I'll go back to one of the big recommendations that came out of our task force work, which was really looking at providing a structure where we can look at individual places or groups of buildings together, sort of small districts or blocks, and say, what are the things about this place that are special? And those are the things we want to save. So identify those special things, identify which of those elements of those special things. And if we use the example of a Philadelphia row house, there's a certain rhythm to row houses. So, and a certain window pattern and cornice line and stoops and steps and things that provide a block. And that frontage of a block matters. Does whether or not the window is vinyl or wood really matter? And that's a question to decide. But if that's less important than that basic, the good bones of a row house block, then maybe for that block, the decision is made, what we want to save is this fenestration pattern and, the fact that the fronts of the buildings are brick and not stucco, and that the stoops are all there, and, that there's this cohesion to it. So is there, and to do that, we won't superimpose all the rules of the Historical Commission on that block, because we've agreed that we're only going to superimpose certain rules. And if we accept those rules, and we can give that neighborhood benefits, maybe they don't have a parking requirement, for example, if the developer comes in and does a bunch of them, so there's no parking requirement. So if there's a trade-off of benefits that happens, then that preserves that neighborhood character without the level of compliance and cost of compliance associated with the full-on designation that could, in fact, encourage saving that block or that housing project or that whatever it is. So I think the structure of it is really good. And it requires, it demands neighborhood input, because the neighbors have to accept, how much are we willing to save and what level of control are we willing to have over our property, and what are we going to comply with in terms of making changes and moving forward.
If I could just quickly add to that, I think involving like artists in the process is a really great idea, and if they're from the community, even better. But I think they can lead more creative ways to think about, to let people decide like what they want to preserve or not. I can think of one example in Philadelphia. This artist, Jenny Chanker, worked with folks at Norris Homes. It's a complicated history, because it's a choice neighborhood. So there wasn't really much decision in if the buildings were going to be torn down or not, but she worked with community members to teach documentation skills and video skills. And so they documented their history, and Norris Homes, they have an amazing community. Like they do every year, like reunions of everyone who has lived in the homes. So, that's what they wanted to preserve. And so I would say like involving artists is also a really good thing to try.
All right, let's go to Keisha's last question. Is there a way that we can have a conversation where preservation tools can be used for ends other than just preserving? For example, organic low-income housing, diversity. Keisha, do you want to sort of help round that out a little bit more?
I don't want to, like, I think I don't want to I'm coming in at the tail end, and I know we're kind of at time, but so, you know, I think that the image of, you know, historic preservation is, you know, that the aim is just preserving. And I've always, you know, kind of feel like it's a tool in the toolbox for other things. And so I think that, you know, maybe when we talk about, does anybody know it's a tool, or how, you know, how can we encourage people to want to be involved, is to use it as a say, well, you know, you're interested in the environment and you can use historic preservation to help you do that. Or you're interested in low-income housing and, you know, here's a, you know, so how can we market preservation as something other, you know, use the narrative to use it for something else. Like that's
no. No, I think that's a really wonderful, wonderful way to think about it, as not just cast and amber. It really is part of an organic living city, and it is part and parcel of kind of all the tools we use to create, you know, vibrant city life. And it, you know, preservation may be the wrong word then, right? Not quite sure what the word is. Eli, it looks like it's probably a wrap.
Yes, I think we are at time. I would love for everyone to give a quiet virtual round of applause to our wonderful panel. This was a tremendous group conversation. So Dominique, Betty, Veronica, Yue, Harris, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share this with friends, family, colleagues, check back on our website in a couple days, and we will have the video up on our website so that you can share this with other people who are interested in joining this conversation. And if you'd like to take part, DAG has a historic preservation task force and a design equity task force. So if you're interested in getting involved, go to our website, connect with dagfellow@gmail.com. Veronica leads the design equity task force. Patrick Grossi, who's on here and is a wonderful preservation activist, is part of DAG steering committee and leads that group. So we love having everyone here. In a couple weeks time, Veronica is going to knock Harris out of the moderator's chair and is going to moderate our next conversation. So
all yours.
Until October 15th at 10 a.m. Thank you again to everybody on the panel, and we will see you in a few weeks.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
So long. Signing off.
Bye-bye.